Hello everyone and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth and in today's video I will be discussing my top 10 favorite nonfiction books in honor of Nonfiction November. I just have to give a shout out to a book olive who created Nonfiction November. I will link her channel below. I love her channel, and it's true. She always has the best nonfiction recommendations. So it was a lot of fun going through my shelves and figuring out which are my favorite nonfiction books. It was not as easy as you would think to narrow it down to 10 books. So many did not make the cut that I just love. But anyways, these are books that I reread, some of them every year. Some of them are new favorites, and I cannot wait to share them with you today. So grab your favorite beverage as we discuss these nonfiction books. The first one I thought would be a lot of fun for some of my fellow bibliophiles, and that is The Little Guide to Your Well-Read Life by Steve Levine. How to get more books in your life and more life from your books. So this is one that I really don't hear anyone talk about. In fact, if you go back on Goodreads, it has very few reviews, but I discovered it back in high school, so about 15 years ago, and I love this book. It was really important to me before things like BookTube came out or Goodreads, because it taught me how to get more out of my reading life, how to annotate books, how to create a reading journal, how and when to DNF books. And then he is really big on having what he calls a list of candidates. So having a section of your bookshelves that are dedicated to brand new books or that are completely empty that you can fill with brand new books. There's not usually a lot of empty shelves in my house, but I try. And I really enjoy this one. He talks about how to start a book club, how to get the most out of audiobooks. And one of my favorite things that he does is he discusses traveling with books, that once you read a book, doesn't mean that you're done with a book. Usually books inspire you to go back and travel or visit a place where an author lived and get the authentic feeling from your travels. And so one of his favorite things to do is when he's visiting an author's house, like let's say Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House, he loves to just kind of pick a flower or pick up a rock and just kind of keep it with him as a memento of his reading life. Really love this book. I think a lot of bibliophiles like myself would love it. It's also a good one to gift to people that want to start reading. I get asked that question all the time of, how do I read more? What should I read? This is a really nice book to give to people like that. Really love this one, and one of my favorite nonfiction reads. The next one is an absolute classic, and that is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I love this book. This book is so important. It's a very short read. It's only about, I think it's less than 200 pages, but it really packs an emotional punch. It's very similar to Night by Elie Wiesel. It tells the story of Viktor Frankl's experience in the Nazi concentration camp, but it's a little unique because Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, so it's almost kind of like half memoir, half self-help book. And he talks a lot about this idea of logotherapy, which is that man needs to have some sort of purpose or meaning in their life in order to live. It's very similar to a concept that I came across a few months ago called Ikigai, the Japanese concept of Ikigai, of having a purpose to add meaning to your life. So it can change and it can fluctuate throughout your life. It can be your family, your job, hobbies. And in this instance, when Viktor Frankl was in a Nazi concentration camp, it got very basic. His purpose was just doing the work. He was so grateful for the work of building walls, of laying down railroad track, of digging ditches, because it gave his mind something to focus on instead of the horrors that was all around him. And so that's what he figured out basically, is that people can control your body, they can take away all your freedoms, but they cannot control what's going on in your mind. So if you have control of your mind, you have control of your destiny. And it's absolutely fascinating, just his experience as a prisoner, some of his insights about fellow prisoners, about the Gestapo themselves. So fascinating. And he also talks about other POW situations and how they survived those situations by just kind of having goals and ambitions and kind of having this whole inner life when they were prisoners. Really, really great. I think it's really good for the times that we're living in now. If you think your life is hard, you think you got it bad, it's really important to read this, because if Viktor Frankl can make it work in a Nazi concentration camp, then all of us can make it work. Love this one, and it's a really important book to read. The next book that I highly recommend for Nonfiction November is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I love this book so much. It is my absolute favorite self-help book, my favorite really nonfiction book of all time. If there was one book I could give to the entire world and just drop from the sky so everyone could read it, it would be this book. I love it that much. I think it's so important that it should actually be taught in schools. Don't get me wrong, I love math, reading, science, but the concepts that Dale Carnegie is talking about are equally as important, of how to relate to other people, how to interact with other people. I think when I was younger, my speech teacher, I remember him telling us that you could be the smartest person in the world, you can have the best ideas, but if you cannot manage people or learn how to relate to people, you're not going to get anywhere in life. And so this book really helps with that, especially if you're a natural introvert like I am, as many readers are. It's really good. A lot of people get turned off by the cheesy title. It's old-fashioned, guys. It was written in the 1930s, but there's nothing wrong with that in my opinion. The stories are just classic. It kind of has that feel like a grandfather is talking to you, like a beloved uncle or aunt or somebody. And a lot of the advice is very basic. What this book is the golden rule. Do unto others as what you would have done unto you. Expanded, kind of fleshed out a little bit. Like, how do you do that? And he tells you how to do it. A lot of it's old-fashioned stuff like smiling, using people's names in conversation. My favorite is don't criticize, condemn, or complain, because that is so true. Anytime I do that, I just butt heads with people. And so Dale Carnegie, his advice is don't do that, basically. I really love this one, and every time I read it, I get something new and something fresh out of it. The next one I would like to recommend for Nonfiction November is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. This was a new to me book this year. I read it for the very first time a couple months ago. If you'd like to learn my thoughts, I will link my August wrap up below, where I discuss this book at length for a good 10 minutes. And as you can see by all the book darts in it, I loved it. I really enjoyed this. I think a lot of people are discovering Thoreau nowadays, because not only did he write Civil Disobedience, which is really important to read right now, he also wrote a fantastic book, Walden, about the return to nature, of just kind of disidentifying from the ego, of learning to live more simply, more humbly. I think it's really important right now during this supply chain crisis. Like, do we really need a million choices? Nah, maybe not. So I think if you're just trying to get back to basics, you'll really enjoy this. I also really like how it's kind of told throughout the seasons. So he goes to Walden Woods, he builds the house, he starts farming, hunting, fishing, and it's just so beautiful if you love nature. It starts off, I think, in the summer, and then transitions from the fall to the winter, and then I think it ends in the springtime. It's just a beautiful book, great writing, and great insights into human nature, which hasn't changed that much in the last 150 years. Love this book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. One author that I referenced quite a bit when I discussed Walden in my wrap-up video was this author, Eckhart Tolle. Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, they remind me a lot of Eckhart Tolle. And just this idea of present moment living, of don't live in the future, don't have regrets about the past, just live in the here and now, and be aware of your awareness, that you're not the ego, you're not that story that you tell in your head, you're just the here and now, you're just kind of witnessing what's going on in your life. Really enjoy this. Eckhart Tolle can be a little difficult to get into, especially if you watch some of his videos on YouTube. He's a little esoteric, but he's an excellent writer, so this book is very easy to understand. If you want to take it to the next level, I highly recommend watching some of those old podcasts that he did with Oprah Winfrey, where they took this book chapter by chapter. In fact, if you go to the Smithsonian, they have Oprah Winfrey's copy of The Power of Now at the African American Museum, I believe, and it's just chock full of Oprah's notes. I loved that exhibit at that museum. Fantastic book, and again, it's one I like to reread every couple years, and I always get something new and something fresh from it. I love Eckhart Tolle. All right, let's get to the good stuff. Enough of those self-help books. Let's talk about memoirs and biographies. So one of my all-time favorite memoirs is one that very few people talk about, if at all, and that is These Wonderful Rumors, The Wartime Diaries of a Young Schoolteacher by Mae Smith. This is published by Virago, one of the top publishers in the world for female authors, and just kind of bringing back these female authors. Fantastic book. I love this one so much. It tells the story of a young school teacher in England. She just lives in this very simple English village during World War II. And it's just a real life account of what life during World War II was like for an average person. So I think people like me that love historical fiction, you see a lot of accounts like this. The one that comes to mind is Dear Mrs. Bird. This is like a real life Dear Mrs. Bird. It's just such a sweet little book. And because Mae was a school teacher, she was kind of on the forefront of all these civic duties and responsibilities. Like when the children came from London, the evacuees, she had to help place them with families. She was also like the warden in charge of, doing the gas mask drills and doing the blackout curtains. And then it's just, she was a young woman as well. So it talks about her experience as a school teacher. If you are a school teacher, I think you will really enjoy this, just when she kind of gets it off her chest about the kids and the principal and the fellow teachers. I think every teacher can relate to that. And it's also very sweet because she is a young woman at this time. I think she's in her early 20s. So she talks a lot about friends and boyfriends and just kind of her social life as well. So in the book, it's kind of a mystery of who she is going to marry. She has feelings for this soldier and this fellow school teacher. So throughout the book, one day she likes one of them, the next day she likes someone else. And it's really sweet at the end to kind of figure out who she eventually ended up with and who she married. So at the very end, the afterword is by her son. And it just kind of includes some pictures of the family at the end. Very sweet, very cute. I love this one. I think one of my favorite scenes in this book is when her and her girlfriends, they go to London to see a Dodie Smith play. How cool is that? I would have loved to see a Dodie Smith play. Even now, how great would that have been? Love this book, and it's just one I wish more people knew about. Okay, for my very favorite memoir of all time, West with the Night by Beryl Markham. This is a very famous book. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. Hopefully, you can bump it up on your TBR now because it's so good. Not only is this one of my favorite nonfiction books, this is one of my favorite books of all time. That's how much I love this book. It's about the famous adventurer Beryl Markham and her experiences as the first pilot, female or otherwise, who flew from Europe to North America. And she flew from England to, I think she famously crash landed in Newfoundland. And her whole life is so fascinating. She starts off as a young child living with her single father in Africa on his cattle ranch. And she was just a little tomboy when she was a kid. And she was out there hunting with all the natives and being stalked by lions. And then in her teens and early 20s, she was a jockey and a horse trainer. Fascinating. And then in her early 20s, she decided to become a bush pilot because why not? She was cool like that. And she's most famous for being around those very famous adventurers like Ernest Hemingway and helping them hunt the big game hunting, like the elephants and the lions and the zebras. But she also, because she was a bush pilot, she was responsible for delivering a lot of the medicine from village to village. I found that part very interesting. And in fact, that's how the book starts out, is they're trying to get this sick guy his medicine and get him out into a hospital. Really, really interesting. And at the end, it's that famous historical flight where she flew from England to Newfoundland. And at the back, you can see the plane where it crash landed. The back is also interesting too because this is not a traditional kind of introduction or summary. It's basically an excerpt from a letter from Ernest Hemingway to his editor, Max Perkins. And he tells Max Perkins, look, you got to read this book. This woman's amazing. I met her. Everything she's saying is true. And FYI, she's a better writer than I am. And that just intrigued me. And that's the reason I read the book, because if Ernest Hemingway, thought she was a better writer than he was, then I had to read it. And guys, it's kind of true. Her writing in this is stunning. In fact, that was my favorite thing about the book, is the writing style. It's just so gorgeous, the language in this. And you get a little jealous of Beryl Markham, quite frankly, because she lived this life. She had all these men in her life. She was so cool. And she was a really great writer. Like, I'm so jealous of her. She's very famous. A lot of books have been written about her. A lot of movies have been made about her. But trust me, you're gonna wanna go back and read the source material. She is a fascinating person. The next memoir slash biography I absolutely adore is Girl Sleuth, Nancy Drew and the Women Who Created Her by Melanie Rehak. And I am so sorry for that sticker on the cover. I cannot get it off for the life of me. But I have to admit, I am a huge Nancy Drew fan. I have not discussed Nancy Drew on this channel yet. I have a really big Nancy Drew collection. So someday I kind of want to do some videos about Nancy Drew. Maybe in 2022 I will. But if you are at all interested in Nancy Drew and you just love female biographies and feminist biographies, if you love discussion about publishing, children's publishing, and if you like historical things like that happened in the Great Depression and early America, I think you will really enjoy this book. It talks about the Stratemeyer Syndicate. So Edward Stratemeyer was very famous for making all these girls and boys adventure stories. He would advertise them in children's magazines, and children would send away from them. And in order to get kids to keep reading, he knew he had to make these books very formulaic, and he had to produce a lot of books. So I think the YA genre and this series format that we have today, it's a trick that publishers are still pulling on us, of just writing multiple books to entice readers to keep reading, to keep buying. So I think Edward Stratemeyer deserves a lot of credit for doing that. His most famous series, besides Nancy Drew, would probably be the Bobbsey Twins and the Rover Boys. And if you're a fan of Nancy Drew like I am, you probably collect a lot of those books as well. I love collecting those Bobbsey Twins ones as well. But Nancy Drew was the brainchild of Edward Stratemeyer. He knew at some point he'd have to come up with a girl detective story to entice girls. What he didn't anticipate was that that series became the most popular of his syndicate. And during this time when Nancy Drew came out, Nancy Drew is almost 100 years old. She's 90 years old, but they came out during the Great Depression. So these kids, of course, they naturally latched on to Nancy Drew because she was young, she was spunky, very pretty, she had her own little roadster, she didn't have a mother, she just had a single wealthy father, she had a lot of autonomy to go places she wanted to go, do things she wanted to do. Of course, a lot of girls look up to her. And even today, a lot of very famous women, people like Oprah, people like Hillary Clinton, Sandra Day O'Connor, have all talked about their love for Nancy Drew. So I think every independent woman, even today, will just gush about Nancy Drew like I do. And this one is so great because after Edward Stratemeyer passed away, his daughter Harriet took over the syndicate. And at one point, Harriet had to write some of the books. But the heart of Nancy Drew is the original Carolyn Keene. Mildred Wirt Benson. So I'm gonna put a picture of her right here when she was 80. So that's Mildred Wirt Benson in her 80s, flying, being an adventurous spirit. And I do think as the original Carolyn Keene and author of Nancy Drew, she really instilled her spirit into Nancy Drew, just that adventurous, smart girl that we all know and love. I could gush about it forever. It's one of my all-time favorites. Okay, you didn't think that I was gonna talk about Nonfiction November and not mention my favorite biographer, David McCullough. I was on the fence of what book to mention as my favorite David McCullough. Is it John Adams? Is it the Wright brothers? It's hard to decide sometimes. I decided for the sake of this video to go with John Adams. I won't get too in depth on this one because I talked about it at length in my US History American Classics video, which I did back in the summer in July. So I will link that below if you're curious. But I talked a lot about Ben Franklin and Frederick Douglass in that video as well. Good picks for Nonfiction November too. But this is my all-time favorite David McCullough biography. I really think it's my favorite biography of all time. I love this one so much. One reason I love David McCullough is because he tells these books in a very narrative voice. They're not dry, they're not boring, they're really, really fun and interesting, and he tells them almost like fiction. The truth is stranger than fiction. That is certainly true when it comes to John Adams. Every aspect of his life was so fascinating. The people that he knew, his travels, his ideas, that you will just fly through this one. Also, you're going to want to read this one to learn about Abigail Adams, who is a fascinating person in her own right. I love Abigail Adams. I really think that if she had lived today, she would have been a politician too. That's how strong and independent she was. And then, of course, a lot of the other founding fathers, his relationship with Thomas Jefferson is very interesting. His relationship with his son, John Quincy Adams, and then some of his other children who he was not that nice to be honest. And then just some of these other figures that we don't hear too much about, like Benjamin Rush, the doctor in Philadelphia. He really played an important part in the Revolution. I really liked Benjamin Rush. Also at the end, John Marshall, who John Adams appointed as the first U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Very interesting, given what's going on in the world right now. I think the Supreme Court, again, is going to have to make a very important decision here in the next couple of weeks. I think I know exactly where John Adams would have stood on what's going on in America right now. I think he and people like Thomas Jefferson actually predicted it. Thomas Jefferson is famous for saying that democracy had to be refreshed every 100 years, and that's certainly happening again in America right now. So if you're like me, like going, what the heck is going on? It's really nice and calming to read John Adams' biography, because it's not how they intended it. Yeah, very, very fascinating, and this is a great one to read right now. And my last recommendation for Nonfiction November, my last favorite nonfiction writer, is Bill Bryson. The book I have is The Road to Little Dribbling. It's just the first one that I picked off my shelf. A lot of them I could not find, but I love Bill Bryson, and especially his travel writing, like Walk in the Woods and Road to Little Dribbling, Notes from a Small Island, Neither Here Nor There, In a Sunburned Country. He is just the best travel writer in my opinion. He travels exactly how I travel, so not adventurous, just he kind of walks around, looks at things, then he goes to a restaurant, has dinner, or he goes to a pub and has a beer, and he goes to bed. And so if you're like that, you just like going places, but you just kind of like to observe people and places, I think you will really enjoy Bill Bryson. His writing is so hilarious, and he is just the ultimate Anglophile. As a fellow Anglophile, as a fellow American that is obsessed with all things British, I really do enjoy Bill Bryson. And he himself is an American citizen, but he also has citizenship in the UK. And so that's very interesting when he talks about that pre-Brexit. So his opinions pre-Brexit are very interesting. Really love him, and he's another great pick for Nonfiction November. Thank you everyone for joining me for Nonfiction November to review my top 10 favorite nonfiction reads. I absolutely love all of these books, and it was quite difficult to whittle down my favorite nonfiction books to just 10. I didn't realize how much I loved nonfiction until making this video. It's such a fantastic genre. I think a lot of us booktubers, we get caught up in the glitz and the glam of fiction, but it's nice to take the time to go back and read some of these nonfiction books because they are the best. Thank you everyone, and happy reading.